It is 1966. A farmer in a field in Ohio watches a disc-shaped object drop out of the sky and land 50 feet from where he is standing. He does not run immediately. He freezes. The object is completely silent. No engine, no exhaust, just a metallic shape sitting in his field like it had been placed there. Then he runs. He calls the police. 2 officers arrive. They see it too. One of them later files a report describing what he calls controlled movement before the object accelerates and disappears. That report reaches the FBI. An agent opens a file. He writes down what the witnesses described near the craft. Beings, 3.5 feet tall, wearing what the report calls spacesuits with helmets. That memo is stamped, filed, and locked away. It stays locked for 60 years. Until May 8, 2026, when the Pentagon published it on a public government website that anyone in the world can visit right now, no clearance required. And that memo is one of hundreds. So the question is not whether something unusual was being reported. The documents confirm that it was. The question is, what kind of government looks at its own people and decides for 80 years that they are not ready to know? This is not a story about whether aliens exist. It is a story about fear and the machinery that fear builds. Because when you read the actual declassified files, not summaries, not press releases, but the raw field reports, the internal memos, the classified program reviews, a pattern emerges that is harder to dismiss than any single sighting. The United States government did not just ignore this subject. It built a system to manage it. That system ran for 8 decades, and what was inside it is now, for the first time, sitting in the open. It starts in the summer of 1947. The war has been over for 2 years. America is rebuilding. The military's attention is fixed on Soviet aircraft and the early tensions of the Cold War. The sky matters, but for very specific, very earthly reasons. Then a rancher named Mac Brazel rides out to check his sheep one morning near Roswell, New Mexico, and finds his pasture covered in wreckage he cannot identify. Metallic fragments scattered across nearly a mile of dry land. Pieces light enough to lift with one hand. Material that bends but snaps back to its original shape. He tries to burn one piece. Nothing happens. He drives to town and tells the sheriff. The sheriff calls Roswell Army Airfield. Major Jesse Marcel, an intelligence officer with a strong service record, drives out with a recovery team, collects the debris, and the following morning an official Army press release goes out with these exact words: "The Army has recovered a flying disc." Those 3 words hit the world like a signal flare. Newspapers print it, radio broadcasts it. For a matter of hours, the question feels close to being answered. Then General Roger Ramey calls a press conference in Fort Worth, Texas. He holds up pieces of foil and rubber. "Weather balloon," he says. The press release was a mistake. Jesse Marcel is photographed holding that foil for the cameras. Years later, before he dies, Marcel states clearly on record that what he held for that photograph was not what his team pulled out of that field. He was a decorated military intelligence officer. That statement is documented. But by the time he said it, the machinery was already decades old. The government's response to Roswell was not silence. It was structure. In 1947, the Air Force launches Project Sign, a classified investigation tasked with determining whether UFO sightings posed a national security threat. The team's formal assessment concludes that the craft being reported were likely not from any known earthly origin. That assessment is ordered destroyed by Air Force Chief of Staff Hoyt Vandenberg. The project is replaced with a new directive carrying a new conclusion: conventional explanations only. But the sightings keep coming. In 1952, radar operators at 2 separate Washington, D.C. airports simultaneously track objects moving over restricted airspace at speeds no known aircraft could reach. Fighter jets are scrambled. The objects change direction and outpace them. The Pentagon holds a press conference and attributes the radar returns to temperature inversions in the atmosphere. The internal memos from that same period say something different. Officers who were there write privately that the objects appeared to be under intelligent control. One officer writes that in 17 years of service, he had never observed anything behave that way. Those memos are classified. Then, in 1952, Project Blue Book begins. Officially, it is the Air Force's open investigation into UFO sightings. It runs for 17 years, collects 12,618 reports, and becomes the most publicly visible thing the government ever does on this subject. But here is what the declassified files reveal. Cases that were too well documented, too credibly reported, too difficult to explain through conventional means. Those cases were quietly separated from Blue Book's official files and reviewed through a parallel channel that carried a higher classification. Blue Book was the public face. A second review was happening behind it. When the Air Force shuts Blue Book down in December of 1969, the official reason is that no national security threat was identified. 701 cases are listed as unidentified. No follow-up. No further explanation. Those 701 files did not disappear. They waited. Here is where the story shifts. Because what makes the newly released documents significant is not that they prove a single dramatic conclusion. It is that they show, consistently, across decades, across agencies, across administrations, that the people responsible for national security took this seriously enough to document it in detail and then lock those documents away. The witnesses in these files are not anonymous. They are named. Many hold rank. In 1965, a deputy sheriff in Damon, Texas, reports chasing a craft for several miles before it stops, hovers, and moves away faster than anything he can estimate. During the encounter, his radio cuts out and his engine falters. His report is on file. His name is in the documents. The same year, multiple sightings across several states are logged in a single week. The Pentagon's own internal review from that period describes 1965 as the year of the greatest volume of reported encounters in the program's history. Not fringe reports. Program documentation. The Ohio incident with the beings in the FBI memo is not isolated. Similar physical descriptions appear in reports from different locations across different years. The detail that keeps recurring in reports written by people who had no contact with each other is the absence of sound and what the reporters consistently call purposeful movement. That word, purposeful, it appears in military field reports, in FBI memos, in Air Force assessments. These were not people describing something drifting or falling. They were describing something that appeared to be going somewhere. May 8, 2026. Secretary of War Pete Hegseth stands before a microphone and says that files kept behind classifications have long fueled justified public speculation. He says the American people deserve to make up their own minds. The files go live. What is in them is now a matter of public record. The Roswell field reports. The classified Blue Book cases that were never officially resolved. The FBI memos, including the description of the beings near the Ohio craft. The 1952 radar logs from Washington, D.C. Apollo mission debriefs, in which astronauts describe observing lights and phenomena during missions that their official transcripts did not address. All of it, sitting there. And for anyone who reads through those documents carefully, the detail that lands hardest is not any single sighting. It is the language that runs through all of them. Document after document, across agencies and decades, uses a specific word to describe the movement of the objects being reported. The word is controlled. Not unknown, not unexplained. Controlled. Controlled flight. Controlled descent. Controlled maneuver. That is not the language of confusion. That is the language of people who believed they were observing deliberate movement and wrote it down in official government records before those records were locked away for a generation. Consider what 8 decades of managed silence actually produced. Jesse Marcel spent years trying to tell his story and was largely dismissed as an aging veteran with a grievance. He died without official acknowledgement. Scientists who worked under classified contracts during the 1950s and 60s completed entire careers without being able to describe their work to anyone outside their clearance level. Some took what they knew to their graves because the classification never lifted in their lifetime. Civilian witnesses who filed reports were in some cases publicly discredited. Their accounts were not investigated. They were managed. The people who were never told anything spent 8 decades being nudged toward the conclusion that their curiosity was irrational, that serious people did not ask these questions. But the serious people, the ones with rank and clearance and signed documents, they were asking the same questions. They just had access to the answers. Here is what sits at the center of this story. In the summer of 1947, men in uniform looked at something they could not explain and made a calculation. They decided that the risk of public panic outweighed the public's right to know. That was a human decision made by specific people in a specific moment. But decisions like that do not stay contained. They become policy. Policy becomes infrastructure. Infrastructure runs for 80 years and calls itself protection. The files are open now. Everything described in this video is drawn from documents that are publicly accessible today. Read them yourself. Draw your own conclusions from what the people who were actually there chose to write down. But consider this. If the judgment made in 1947 was that you were not ready for the truth, the more important question is not what they found in that desert. It is who gets to decide what you are ready for, and whether that decision was ever really about protecting you. If this story opened something for you, subscribe. There is a lot more history that has been waiting to be told.